And when he came in again, it was with a tray laid, with a tray cloth that hadn't been out of the linen cupboard since mother died, and there was a brown boiled egg in her cockerill egg cup, and thin bread and butter, and strawberry jam, and a cup of tea, all arranged nicely on the tray and on the best china. The final touch was that one of the slices of bread had been cut meticulously into soldiers for dipping into her egg, and managed to smile her gratitude at him. But as soon as he had departed, the tears rolled freely down her face. There was a quality to his kindness that nearly broke her heart. Anne woke the next morning with a very nasty sore throat, and Dad was worried enough about her to telephone for Dr. Ross. He came about mid-morning when Anne was listening in a bored way to the radio and flicking over the pages of a detective novel. "Living the life of Riley, aren't you?" he said cheerfully. "What wouldn't I give for a day or two in bed?" "You can have it," she croaked. "Whatever it is." "Laryngitis," he said briskly. "Soon cure that. I'll give your dad a prescription for some penicillin, the old wonder drug, you know. They'll have you on your feet right as ninepence in no time at all." "How long is it, no time at all?" Anne inquired, having known him nearly all her life. "You'll be back to work on Monday." "I should take the rest of the week off. I knowed that throat of yours. Stay in bed for a couple of days and then just rest. I'll give the prescription to your dad, and he can run it down to Moore's. I had to take it myself, but I'm going the other way. Cheerio then, Anne. Keep your pecker up." Dad obligingly phoned the news through to Anne's bosses and went down to Moore's on his bike with the prescription. Anne was not too worried by the sore throat or the accompanying symptoms, nor even by missing a week at work, but she was afraid she was going to be driven mad with boredom. She was very glad, therefore, to get a visitor at lunchtime. "I've given up my entire lunch break to come and soothe your bed of pain," Wendy said, gusting into the bedroom on a cloud of perfume and sitting on the side of the bed. "Isn't that kind of me?" "Very kind," Anne agreed, as best she could. "My God, that sounds terrible. What is it you've got? I hope it's not catching," Wendy said. And, without obliging Anne to reply, went on. "I telephoned you at work today, or rather tried to, but of course you weren't there. Old Wet Drawers said that your dad had just that moment phoned to say you were on your deathbed and not likely to be back at work until the millennium. So I had this idea of incredible nobility and generosity." She struck her chest proudly. "I get these attacks from time to time. It's in my nature." "Who drove you down here?" "Who did what?" Wendy said, sounding incredulous and hurt. Anne smiled. "You wouldn't have come if you'd had to use the bus," she croaked. "There's gratitude for you. Heap someone up with kindness and they spit in your eye. Well, it was Roberto, actually," she said modestly. Anne made who's Roberto noises, and she went on. "He's the new waiter in the Italian restaurant. His name's Robert. Robert, actually. He isn't Italian, of course, just looks like it. He's from Blandford. He worked in a wimpy bar there, and this is a step up for him. So he's practicing the accent in case he can get a job in an Italian restaurant in London. That's his ambition. So I call him Roberto because he says it helps him if he thinks Italian. And you can't think Italian if someone's tugging your elbow and calling you Bob all the time. She paused for breath, and he calls me Lucia, you know, like in the song Santa Lucia, because he says there's absolutely nothing you can do with Wendy in Italian. You can't even say it with an Italian accent. Where's Roberto now? Why didn't you bring him in? He's gone back to town. He'll come and collect me later, Wendy said. You'll never guess who I saw last night. Whom? Whom I saw last night in Roberto's restaurant. Were you eating there? How expensive of you. Oh no, I wasn't eating there at all. I was waiting for Roberto to come off duty, and I peeped out through the service hatch, and right over in the corner at a table with a candle I saw. Anne's memory conjured up her vivid picture of that night in Weymouth, the little table with a candle and Michael reaching across to take her hand. You're Mr. M.F. Conrad in person, noshing in style on the best menu you can offer, though the most expensive thing on the menu's only $2.50, which can't compare with some of the places he must have been. I'll bet when he took you to Weymouth, it cost more than that. Still, this isn't Weymouth, and it's a lot better than taking her to the Forum Caf for eggs and chips, like old Joe did with you. Who? Who? Who was M.F. Conrad buying dinner for in the Italian restaurant? Anne asked carefully. Wendy shrugged indifferently. Oh, I don't know, some girl or other. She looked Italian, though judging by my experience with Roberto, that probably means she comes from Winterbourne, Zelstone, and talks like something off the Archers. Anne felt dizzy, though Wendy didn't at first notice, and went on prattling gaily about nothing in particular. Anne found her heart hammering in a most peculiar way. She tried to tell herself that it was nothing, that Wendy was mistaken, but she knew that wasn't true. Wendy couldn't possibly mistake Michael. She had stared at him too often for that. It must be true. And all the warnings she had been given in vain. He was the kind of man who always had several girls on a string, and if one failed him, another took her place. She had been warned about him almost from the beginning, but she had still foolhardily gone ahead and fallen in love with him. Never love a stranger, they had all said in their various ways, even poor Joe, who had no reason to feel kindly about her. He had presumably discovered that she was ill, and far from hurrying to see her as Wendy had, and dear kind Joe had immediately set about fixing himself up with someone else to take her place. Anne felt rather sick at the thought of her own feelings for him, and the fool she might have made of herself, and as she closed her eyes against the rush of nausea, Wendy at last noticed there was something wrong. Here, you don't look quite the thing, she said anxiously. You've gone all pale. Are you all right, Anne? Shall I call your dad? She took Anne's hand and patted it anxiously, and Anne closed her fingers around the comforting grasp and shook her head. No, it's nothing. I'm all right. I'll be all right in a minute. It's just... She opened her eyes and looked at Wendy, who, for all her pretended insensitivity, must have read something of the trouble in Anne's expression. Listen, you're not upset about you know who, are you? Listen, Anne, you mustn't take anything like that to heart. You know what those kind of fellows are. They mean every word of what they say when they're saying it. It's just that they say it 10 times a week to 10 different girls. You didn't take it seriously now, did you? Tell your old Auntie Wendy you don't mind it. He can't help it, poor soul. It's just the way he is. I'm the same myself. Never could settle for one flower when there's so many to flitz around. She sounded really anxious, and Anne tried to smile and shook her head again. No, no, it's nothing like that, she said. But even as she said it, the tears began to seep out from her eyes, and they both knew she was lying. After that, she could hardly expect a visit from Michael, and she told herself that she did not expect it. Why then, when her father announced a visitor for her own on Friday, did her heart leap so treacherously? I was passing, so I thought I'd drop in and see you, said the doctor. You don't look as well as I expected. Not up yet? Oh, I'm all right, she said listlessly. I'm just being lazy, I suppose. Well, you certainly sound better as far as the voice goes. I expect it's the penicillin making you droopy. Let's see the throat. Yes, well, that seems to have cleared up itself, doesn't it? Keep taking the tablets until they're all gone anyway, just to make sure. Yes, I will, Anne said. You sound in the dumps, Dr. Ross said sternly. I'm all for taking it easy when the patient benefits from it. But in your case, I'd say you were feeling a wee bit too sorry for yourself. I think you should get up, get dressed, and go for a nice walk. It's a lovely day. Nowhere to go, Anne said, childishly. There's nothing worse than being talked to briskly when you're feeling sunk in the depths of gloom. You can go and have a look at the little cottage I've seen for sale across at Little Hoffman. That's only half a mile by the fields. I thought it would just do nicely for you and your dad. Why for us? Anne asked, pricking up her ears with interest. I had it from Moore. Apparently your father was talking to him when you took the prescription in about the business of British Rail turfing you out. He reckoned, your dad, that is, that if he could find an alternative place to that bungalow that wasn't too expensive, he might be able to persuade them to buy it for him instead. That sounds like a possible plan, Anne said, without too much hope. Where is this place? It more or less faces a railway line, just beyond the Triple Bridge. You know where I mean, where that big house with the tall chimney is. You can't see the cottage until you're right up to it, because of the edges around the big house. But from the cottage you can see the railway line perfectly. It sounds ideal, Anne said with a laugh. It's a nice little place, the doctor said. It's been modernized. One of my new patients bought it and did it up, but he didn't like the idea of an outside toilet, even though it's a proper mains drain flushing job. So he moved. It's on the market now, and I dare say it wouldn't be too expensive. The only thing I wonder is if you'd find it a bit small for the two of you. My patient was a widower and not likely to remarry. Lived there with his dog and was snug as a bug in a rug. But you and your dad might find it a thought too snug. I don't know. Have you told Dad about it? I told him. He said he'd go and have a look, but he sounded a bit gloomy about it. Just like you did before, I told you. See how much more cheerful you are now? You're thinking of someone else and not yourself. You're always right, Anne said. Don't you get sick of it? How could I? It's my job to be right. Anyway, I must get on now. I've been guessing to you long enough. Get out and get some fresh air, and don't be moping around in your room. Cheerio for now. In the end, Anne and her father both went to see the cottage after lunch. Dad on his bike with Anne on the crossbar. We can walk back, he said, if you feel you need the exercise. It was a dear little cottage, a real Dorset cottage, cob-ended and newly thatched, with the thatch decorations of the local men. Each thatcher decorated his roofs in his own style so that everyone knew who had done them, and the Winton man was one of the old Dorset Catholic families, and always decorated the center of the ridge with a stylized plaited cross. The cottage had been whitewashed, and the window frames painted smart black, bold against the white stone. The garden was rather overgrown, as could be expected, and was sweet with honeysuckle that rioted everywhere and attracted the bees for miles around. They couldn't get into the cottage, of course, but they walked through back to the garden and found it in better order, having been dug for vegetables before the owner left it. The toilet was discreetly tucked away from a side path and again decorated with honeysuckle, and there was a damson tree in the middle of the small lawn. It's beautiful, Anne said enthusiastically. Really, I can't imagine why anyone would want to leave it. Outside loo or no outside loo. Dad said non-committedly, but taking a glance at him. Anne saw that he loved it, that it was the kind of place he could have chosen if he had limitless choice. It was built for him, absolutely. It would fit round him like his own body now fitted round his heart. The only thing was, as the doctor had said, that it was very small. It was so small it was like a doll's house, and standing in the garden in the front, one could touch the bottom of the upstairs window. I wonder if we can get permission to view it, she mused. She had been inside a similar cottage before, and thought that it would probably have one room downstairs and two tiny ones upstairs. The kitchen was housed in a single-story extension at the back, and the bath would be a tin one, stood on the kitchen floor when needed, and filled with kettles. As the doctor said, really a bit too small for her and Dad. Too small, Dad said, as if echoing her thoughts, but she heard the sigh in his voice as he said it. No harm in going to have a look at it anyway, Anne said. No, no harm. After all, you never know, Anne said. She said it only vaguely to cheer him up, without meaning anything, but his expression brightened at once, and he said more cheerfully, No, you never know, after all. After all, he meant you might still marry Joe. After all, Anne added for herself, he did come and visit you on your sickbed, which was more than that fancy chap from London did, for all his money and big cars. She knew the lines off by heart, having said them all to herself in preparation. Not that Dad would say them aloud unless she provoked him, but she knew he was thinking them, and that was almost as bad. On Friday night, Anne was watching the television and half-heartedly repairing a pair of tights when there was a knock on the door. She was startled for a moment, and then, dredging up from the depths of her subconscious memory the sound of a car, she thought it was probably Joe, come to visit her again. She jumped up, eager for company, and not at all sorry to see Joe again, even after their last meeting. After all, he had been proved right, hadn't he? And he'd only meant it for the best at time. She opened the door. Dad was across, at the station, and at once her heart gave such a lurch that she thought she would literally faint. She clutched the doorknob until her fingers went white and stared at him without being able to speak for a moment. "Hello, can I come in?" Michael said, having waited for her to speak first. Anne still could not speak. He cocked his head on one side and said, "Am I intruding?" "Say it once if you'd rather I didn't interrupt." Was he suggesting she had someone else in there, she thought. Outraged, she shook her head. "I'm alone," she said. He smiled pleasantly and nudged her gently out of the way, since she didn't look as though she was going to move. She turned her head to follow him, and the light struck her face. "I say, you don't look very bright," he said with concern. "Are you ill?" That was pretty cool coming from him, she thought. But then, coolness was to be expected from the expert. "I've had laryngitis," she said coldly. He drew his hands out from behind him and presented her with a beautiful bunch of flowers. "In that case, my present is doubly appropriate. I do hope you are better." "Yes, thank you," she said. She took the flowers with an automatic gesture. They were roses, pink roses, 3 shades of pink, tied up in a florist's wrapper. Hothouse roses, of course, this early in the year, or imported. Expensive, anyway. "I should have thought you'd know I was ill," she said. He walked ahead of her into the sitting room, and she followed him, wondering why she didn't just tell him to go. But of course her turncoat heart knew the answer to that. At the sight and sound of him, her heart had resumed its stupid, blind, pig-headed love of him, despite anything her mind could say. "How could I know?" he said easily. "I've been away. Or didn't you notice?" He regarded her with his bright, level gaze. "Ah, is that the reason for the big frost? You didn't know I'd gone away, and you thought I was neglecting you on your sickbed?" "How could I know you were away?" she echoed him. "You didn't tell me." She half wanted him to explain, was half afraid that he would tell a lie she'd see through. "I was going to send you a note," he said, settling himself with charming ease on the sofa and patting the seat beside him. She seated herself as a compromise on the nearest armchair to him. "To tell you I'd be away. But then I thought, why waste words? She'll know I'm away when she doesn't see me. And if she doesn't notice that she hasn't seen me for a while, it will prove she doesn't care a jot for me, and then I can throw myself off the nearest bridge." Anne turned her face away to hide her feelings. It was too bad of him to sound as if he cared whether or not she cared. He saw the gesture, but misread it. But I wasn't to know that while I was away, my beloved would be struck down with, whatever was it? Laryngitis, she said, and it sounded foolish. Very nasty, he said sullenly. Laryngitis, anyway, and be cut to the quick that I had left her to die alone. My very humblest apologies, he finished, contriving to bow from the waist while remaining seated. Had I known, I'd have been making use of the opportunity to bring you hothouse grapes and nectarines and wild strawberries and bottles of rare oriental cordial. I always wanted to buy you things. Instead, thought Anne, you made use of the opportunity to fix yourself up with someone germ-free. Where did you go then? She asked, trying not to sound interested. Up to Birmingham, he said easily, Mecca of the motor car, the home of the internal combustion engine. I had various people I had to let know about my new enterprise here. I hope to be agent for one of 2 firms that pays the rent quite nicely, while other bits and pieces provide the profits. And when did you go? This is beginning to sound like the Guard or Grand Inquisition. When did you last see your father? He clowned. On Monday night. Star of my East on Monday night. Anne turned her face towards him, and all her bitterness must have been in her eyes as she said, quietly but firmly, Yet you were in a restaurant here in Winton on Tuesday night with a dark-haired lady. There was quite a long silence while Michael stared at her. His expression was one of surprise, but that might be surprise that she knew. And was he, in that long silence, working out what to say? At last he said quietly, Who tells you so? You were seen, she said flatly. There was another pause while he stared at her again, and a strange expression flickered across his face. She didn't quite know what it was. Could it be disappointment in her? Then he got up and walked across to the window and stood there with his back to her. She saw that his hands were clenched into fists. Guilt or anger? Well, she said at last, aren't you going to try and justify yourself? Do you consider being in a restaurant with a dark-haired lady something that needs a justification? Is it a crime? He asked. Anne looked at his back and was glad that he could not see her face. No, not at all. I have no right to say who you should dine with, but what I think needs justifying is that you should lie about it to me. If you have to lie, then it means it must be something you're ashamed of. Not necessarily, he said, turning around. His face was dark with some emotion she did not understand, and his eyes were bright and dangerous. I can think of many reasons why I might not tell you I dined with a dark-haired lady. A secret is not of itself a guilty thing. Then why did you keep it secret? Keep what secret? He asked. Dining with the dark-haired lady, she said angrily. Don't prevaricate. My dear Miss Simmons, wherever I was on Tuesday night, it was not in Winton dining at a restaurant with a dark-haired lady. You deny it? I certainly don't deny it. It isn't a matter for denial, he said with a spark of anger. I simply tell you that I was not there. Why should I believe that? She asked bitterly. I was told you were there by someone who saw you. What you believe is your own affair, he said calmly. As I see it, you have two alternatives. You can believe this friend, for want of a better word, who tells you she saw me, or you can believe me when I tell you I wasn't there. And before you ask me for proof, he said, anticipating her opened mouth, let me tell you that I have no intention of attempting to prove anything. Your disbelief or belief must come from yourself. I wouldn't stoop to try to prove it. I wasn't going to ask for proof, Anne said more mildly. I was just going to ask how you know the person who told me was a she. Intuition, my dear Watson, he said, grinning infectiously, just as if they weren't having a bitter quarrel. Only she would bring tales like that to you. Oh, Anne said. She paused to try and sort out her thoughts, and could not, and looked up at Michael for his help. Make it easy for me, her eyes pleaded. Make up my mind for me. You're on your own, kid, he said, but he said it gently, looking down at her almost as if he felt sorry for her. Belief comes from inside. You've only got to show me the door if you want me to go. Wendy had seemed to be telling the truth. Why would she lie? How could she be mistaken? On the other hand, Michael seemed to be telling the truth too. The very fact that he would not argue with her had a ring of truth about it. Belief comes from inside. Which of them did she believe? The stranger she knew so little about, or the friend she had known for so long? Which did she care more about? The casual friend she had coffee with, or the man she had fallen in love with, whom, even now, she ached to kiss? And while she wondered, her eyes remained fixed on his face, and after a moment he took a step backwards, and then towards her, and without her knowing, and without her even knowing it, her arms went out to him, and in a second he had crossed the rest of the space to her, and she was in his arms, strained against his chest, her head buried against his shoulder. Oh, Michael, she said, people have been saying such awful things about you ever since you came here, and everyone seems to want to arm me against you and warn me off, as if you were some kind of white slaver or drug peddler or something. Oh, but I am worse, far worse, he said, and she felt him laughing. I'm like the marauding Dane who plunders the town and snatches away the womenfolk. I can understand them, of course. Any town that had a jewel like you would naturally be jealous of any stranger taking it away. They're jealous, that's all. Take no notice of them. Here, there, don't cry, Anne, darling. Not on my best suit. Oh, don't, she laughed in the midst of a sob. There, you don't know if you're laughing or crying. Here, sit down with me. That's right, dry your eyes. I've got another present for you, in my pocket. Stop crying, and I'll give it to you. He was like a man with a child, but then she'd been behaving pretty much like a child. She dried her eyes and blew her nose, sitting on the sofa with his arm round her, a strong arm, and the one she wanted to be there. Then, when he judged she had stopped sniffing, he dug his hand into his pocket for the present. She was reminded of that terrible moment when Joe had put his hand in his pocket and brought and brought out the unwanted engagement ring. "There," he said, "some lovely expensive Swiss chocolate. You can't buy it in Winton, so that proves I've been away." She took it and laughed shakily. "I thought you weren't going to offer me proof," she said, although it only proved he'd been away, not when. "That was when you wanted proof, but you don't want it now, do you? You've made your mind up without it." "Yes," she said, "I suppose I have." "I learned a long time ago, Anne," he said, suddenly serious, "that there's no use in arguing against suspicion. It only makes it more suspicious. If someone accuses you of something they think is wrong, they'll make up their minds whether you're guilty or not, without any help from you. Anything you say only adds fuel to the fire." That expression of disappointment that had crossed his face, had she reminded him then of that other person who had failed him in this way? "Who was it who taught you?" she asked shyly. He gave her a hug and looked down into her face with affection. "I'll tell you some time, not now." Then he smiled and attempted to lighten the atmosphere. "You can't expect me to give away all my secrets in one go." "No, I can wait," she said. "Would you like a cup of tea? I can put the kettle on while I put these in water." "I thought you'd never ask," he said. "I think your other flowers need removing, poor things." The bluebells Joe had brought her, typical of him, as the roses were typical of Michael. But the bluebells were dead now, wizened into brown ghosts in the vase. She picked up the vase and took it with her to the kitchen, thinking as she did, so that he did not ask her who had brought her those flowers. He didn't ask those sorts of questions. He was stronger than she. When she came back with the roses arranged in the vase, she thanked him for them again and kissed him. She had forgotten the bluebells and had almost forgotten the quarrel. When Dad came across from the station, they were sitting on the sofa reading the paper together and talking in low, relaxed voices. They made a pretty picture, sitting there with their heads together in complete harmony. And had Dad not had his heart set on Joe, he might have taken courage from the sight and worried less about his only daughter being left on the shelf. As it was, he only said, "Oh, you've got a visitor. I'll make myself scarce." "Don't be silly, Dad," Anne said, jumping up and kissing him on the cheek. "You sit down, and I'll make another cup of tea for us all. Do you want a sandwich as well?" "Could do with one, I suppose." "All right. You sit and talk to Michael. I won't be long." She said that, but she was as long as she could reasonable be, to give them the best chance of getting into conversation, and when she came back with the tray, she found that, as she had expected, Michael's charm had worked on Dad, and he was telling the younger man all about rabbits and the glorious days of steam, his two greatest passions. It was quite late when Michael eventually took his departure, promising to pick Anne up on Saturday night and take her to the dance at the Villiers Hotel in Winton Magna. Anne went with him to the front door to see him out and to get another breathtaking kiss. "Well, at least I've convinced your father I'm not a white slaver," Michael said when he finally released her. "Oh, Dad's all right. He's just a bit suspicious of strangers." "Strangers?" How long before I stop being considered a stranger? In Winton, it generally takes about 40 years. Thank heaven I don't have to wait that long. I wasn't talking about Winton foolish, he said, giving her a final kiss. I was talking about you. The dance at the Villiers Hotel was held every year and was a large and well-attended fair, and Anne was privately glad that Michael had returned in time to take her there. She was also, even more secretly, glad that fate had arranged it so that she went with Michael rather than Joe, for she had already discovered that Michael was as competent a dancer as he was everything else, whereas Joe could only do the walk around to slow music, known locally as the smooch. When he had taken her to dances, they seemed to spend most of their time standing around in groups chatting, while Anne watched the whirling dancers with distant envy. All in all, she decided, the occasion called for a new dress, and having dispatched such household chores as her father allowed her to do, she got out her bike and cycled into Market Winton. The town was always full on a Saturday, with a different kind of crowd from Thursdays. Now it was women out for being. Now it was women out for their big shop of the week, with push-chairs and sweet-sucking kids, while Dad carried the smallest on his back, and sometimes held the lead of a straining mongrel dog. It was odd how all the townspeople's dogs were ill-trained like that, and whatever speed their owners were walking, they would pull so hard against the lead that they would progress on 2 feet only and make an unearthly gargling noise as the collar choked them. There was also a lot of local young lads, roaring aimlessly up and down the narrow high street on motorbikes, or leaning in groups against their push bikes on the car park behind Woolworth's. The young girls went about in pairs, looking in the dress shops, standing outside the record mart, listening to the latest tunes, and pretending not to notice when the youths called out to them. The old folk toiled very slowly up the side streets looking for bargains, or labored even more slowly up the stairs to the coffee bar on the first floor of Hiblett's for a cup of milky coffee and a rock cafe and a rock cake and their weekly natter to their fellow pensioners. Anne loved it all, of course, and made the most of her slow cycle through the town. She always felt that there were 3 Wintons, the ordinary weekday one, the Thursday one, and the Saturday one. It compensated a little for living in the same place for so long, and such a small place at that. Her destination that morning was the cobbled street known as Gobb's Alley, which led off the high street and was lined with shops which, by chance or design, had all been turned into clothes shops, shoe shops, record shops, and similar places of interest to young people. It had once tried to style itself the Carnaby Street of Winton. It said in the local guidebook that the name was originally God's Alley because it had led up to the long-defunct monastery, and remembered from her school days a rudder explanation the boys had thought up. There was in Gobb's Alley, however, a very good little boutique which Anne had patronized before, and having chained her bike to one of the bollards at the foot of the street, she walked towards it. She hadn't gone more than a few yards, however, when Wendy came out of the record shop at the bottom and joined her with a cheerful greeting. "Hello! Are you better?" "Of course you are, or you wouldn't be here." "Going to the dance tonight?" "Yes," Anne said. "Are you?" She was rather cool, not knowing quite how to take Wendy after that business about the restaurant. "But of course, that's why I'm here. To buy a new dress, something that will shake Winton to its Roman foundations and write my name in the town's history." "What are you doing here?" "I've come to buy a new dress too," Anne admitted. Wendy nodded happily. "Good. Then we'll look together, and you can tell me if things suit me or not, and I'll do the same for you." And she tucked her arm through Anne's as they walked on. "Who are you going with tonight?" she asked next. "Michael," Anne said, watching her sideways for a reaction. Wendy did not seem at all surprised. She merely nodded with polite interest. "Who are you going with?" "I'm not sure," Wendy said. "I'm going there with Roberto, and I have a kind of feeling I agreed to meet Graham there, so there might be an almighty blow-up. I wish I could remember. I'd ask him only. He's been on his week's holiday, and he doesn't get back until this afternoon. Oh well, I suppose it doesn't matter too much. Shall we go in here?" "I was intending to," Anne said, as they reached her favorite shop. They went in and sifted through the rack of dresses hovered over by a minute 14-year-old with a habitual sniff, who helped out on Saturdays. Wendy gathered up 3 or 4 things and hurried off to the changing room, and Anne went on sifting more slowly until she found what she was looking for. It was flame red chiffon with drooping sleeves and a skirt in 2 layers with jagged ends, like the party dresses of the 1930s. It was her size too, and she followed Wendy with it happily. When she tried it on, it was just right, as she had known it would be. The vivid color set off the darkness of her hair, and the clear pallor of her skin, and the style, of course, was exactly hers. Wearing it still, and taking sideways glances at her reflection, she waited for Wendy to decide on what she wanted. It was one of those communal changing rooms, so she could stand and talk while Wendy tried on one thing after another. "I have a fancy for black," Wendy was saying. "The Italians think it's sexy." "But Roberto isn't Italian," Anne pointed out. "He's only an Italian waiter." I know. Must you spoil my illusions?" Wendy said, straining at the zip of a black crepe sheath. "Didn't you try to spoil mine?" Anne said. Having said it, she found she was shaking. "Did I?" Wendy said vaguely. "Do the zip up for me, will you? I can't shift it." "You've got it caught in the material. Stand still." "Yes, you did. You told me Michael was in Roberto's restaurant with another woman last week." "Oh, was he? Naughty old Michael. There now, what do you think? Not too hot, eh?" "Not hot at all. The point was, he wasn't there." "Who wasn't there?" "Undo it again, will you?" "Michael wasn't at the restaurant." "That's good," Wendy said, even more vaguely from the depths of the dress. I think I'll like this one better anyway. Give me a hand. Well, why did you say he was there if he wasn't? Anne asked, feeling she was getting nowhere. I don't know. I must have thought I saw him, if I said so, mustn't I? But he says he wasn't there. Then there's nothing to worry about, is there? Wendy said reasonably. I don't think black suits me after all. I could have told you that in the beginning, Anna said gloomily. Why didn't you then? I didn't want to spoil your illusions, Anne countered, and Wendy stuck her tongue out at her friend's reflection. The red dress continued to look just right. Anne was glad, for sometimes a purchase loses some of its glamour when you get it home. But this looked, if anything, even better when she finally put it on with her silver sandals and her string of pearls, having spent nearly an hour over her face and hair. Happiness added its own glow to her looks, and when Michael arrived in plenty of time, and an Aston Martin, he looked at her for some seconds before saying anything. Well, do I look all right? Anne asked at length. I can't think of anything to say that would be adequate, he said, taking her hands and looking at her in a way that made her tingle. You're beautiful. And he kissed her, carefully so as not to rumble her. Shall we go? I thought we could have one drink on the way so as not to arrive too early. Would that suit you? Anything you say, Anne said equably. Is that another car I see? Oh yes, it's one I brought back from Birmingham with me. I have to tune it and deliver it back, so I thought I'd get a ride out of it while I have it. Lovely cars. It looks sporty, Anne agreed. I must say goodbye to Dad, and then I'll be ready. They were not the only people to stop off for a drink at the Bull, the nearest pub to the Villiers. There were several other couples in the doubles bar there, all dressed for the dance, and among them was Wendy, with a saturnine youth who looked at least 3 years younger than his partner. That must be Roberto, the Italian waiter, Anne said to Michael. She was glad she had someone as mature-looking as Michael to brave the crowds with him. Wendy, however, was a match for anyone, and she came bouncing over as soon as she saw Anne, and the dark boy followed her. He was wearing a very tight velvet suit, which might account for his preoccupied air. It looked as though it might split with any unexpected movement. Hello, there you are, Wendy greeted them. Hello, Michael. Do you know Roberto? Roberto, this is Anne and Michael. How do you do? Anne said politely. Hello, Roberto said. Anne wondered if that was hello in Italian or if he had adenoids. You bought the blue one in the end, she remarked to Wendy, who still hadn't chosen a dress when Anne had left her in town that morning. You'll never guess who I've just seen, Wendy broke in without noticing the remark. Whom? Anne said. Whom? Said Anne and Michael together, and they turned to grin at each other. Old Joe Halderthay with a lady on his arm. Didn't we, Roberto? And guess who the lady was? Who? They chorused again. It was the new Lady Vet from Upwood. How about that for sensational news? He certainly works fast. She hasn't been there for more than a week or so, and she's quite reasonably good-looking. Why shouldn't she be? Anne said, nettled at what she thought was a slight on Joe. She felt Michael looking at her with a raised eyebrow, and she pressed his arm to reassure him. Oh well, you know what bets are like. They're usually bunchy women in old tweeds and felt hats. But this one's quite young and pretty. Well, at least she isn't ugly. Let's have a drink, shall we? Michael said, feeling that enough had been said on this particular subject. What does everyone want? No, let me, Roberto said. It was adenoids, Anne decided. Thanks, old chap, Michael agreed, graciously. Just a tonic water for me. I'm driving and I don't want to use up my allowance too soon. Anne? Gin and tonic, please, with lots of ice. My usual, please, Wendy said, and Roberto nodded and departed. I've taken to drinking Campari soda, she said, when he had gone, so don't stand too close to me or I'll clash with your dress. Such an uncompromising color, red. You have to be a real beauty like Anne to wear it. I'd look like a plate of mashed swede if I tried it on. The drinks, when they came, seemed to loosen Roberto's tongue, and he turned out to be good fun in a quiet way. Wendy was at her irrelevant, amusing best, and the four of them enjoyed themselves so much that when it was time to leave, they stayed together and drove up to the Villiers in Michael's car. The dance was filling up quite nicely. They handed in their tickets in the anteroom and went to drop their wraps and powder their noses, while the men waited and did whatever men do while women powder their noses. He's as gorgeous as ever, Anne said. He's as gorgeous as ever, Wendy said to Anne as they shared a mirror. Who, Roberto? Anne asked, surprised. No, Mr. Martini. You're a lucky girl. Am I? Anne mused. She looked at her smiling reflection. I suppose I am. The large ballroom was softly lit and decorated with flowers, and already a couple of dozen couples were dancing to the excellent band. The bar was crowded, as it always mysteriously is at dances, and there was a separate buffet room where the food was being laid out for later in the evening. They spent some time walking around and saying hello to the various people they knew, and Anne noticed how most people stared at Michael, some with envy and some with suspicion. She kept her hand on his arm, and once he squeezed it and said, You see how they all look on me as a stranger? But when she glanced up at him, he was laughing, so it was all right. They didn't meet Joe and his lady yet, though Wendy said she saw him across the other side of the room. However, Anne was now inclined to give less credence to what Wendy saw at any kind of distance. The doctor was there with his wife, a pleasant, gray-haired lady with a limp, whose interest in dances was, therefore, more social than athletic. Hello, Anne. You look ravishing, he said. So do you, Anne said. Mrs. Ross, won't you introduce us to your partner? Anne did so, and the doctor and Michael shook hands, and Michael bent over the doctor's wife's hand in a graceful way that made her smile. Did your father have a look at that house? Dr. Ross asked. We both did, Anne said. I could tell he loved it on sight, as I did, really. Only I think it probably will be too small. I should think it's only got one room downstairs and two tiny ones up, and we might get on each other's nerves in such a small place. Leave home, then, Dr. Ross suggested at once. I don't know what a great girl like you is doing anyway, living under her father's wing. It's well past time you spread your wings and flew away. George, you shouldn't bully people, his wife remonstrated gently. People need to be bullied. They like it anyway, Dr. Ross affirmed. You go out and see the world, young Anne, while you are young. Time enough to settle down in dear old Winton when you get creaky with age, like me. Not like you, Marjorie darling, I hastened to add. And his wife smiled. Why don't you marry her, young man? The doctor went on incorrigibly, and take her round the world. That would solve her father's problem. He could move into that little cottage and be settled for life. If I marry her, sir, Michael said with a suppressed smile, it won't be for her father's sake. Anne looked up at him with wide eyes, and he winked without moving the rest of his face. The doctor's wife saw it and tugged at her husband's arm. Come away, George. You embarrass the young people. Goodbye for now, Anne, and give my love to your father. Not the world's most tactful man, Anne said softly as they moved away. He's all right, Michael said musingly. Shall we dance? After all, it's supposed to be what we came for. I'm ready, Anne said.